What's up, Make Pop Music? It's Austin here from Make Pop Music and Austin Hall Audio, and today I'm going to show you how to get huge low end in your pop mixes like this.
Can't get you out of my head. You know I've been lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your gravity since the day you met ya. Don't know why you do it, got a hold on me. But after all this time you gotta set me free. Baby, I've been coasting,
What's up, everyone? It's Austin here from Make Pop Music and Austin Hall Audio, and today we are back with another video. And earlier this week we posted a poll on our Instagram to see what videos you guys would vote on seeing this week, and the winner by a slight advantage, probably the smallest advantage that we've ever seen, was how to get huge low end in your pop mixes, which is a topic we've never really covered on the channel, so I am excited to dive in. And in today's video I want to take a look at some preventative measures that you can do to make sure your low end doesn't get out of hand. I want to kind of show you how to sculpt your arrangement to make sure that the low end can really thrive as good as it can, and then I want to show you a couple tips on how I like to get low end sitting really well in a mix, how to get it heard on small speakers, and make sure that it's big and it's full and it's punchy without being loose and taking up way too much space and just killing your overall mix. So if you've been looking for how to get that tight, punchy, big low end without it really just swallowing up your entire mix, hopefully by the end of this video we will address some of your issues. If you like the song that we're using in today's video, it is out right now. I think it just came out today. You can go check it out. There's a link in the description. It's called Close by Nightbreakers. We've done them before on the channel and you guys always love their stuff. So I did produce this, mixed it, mastered it. So if you want to go hear the full song, you can click the link in the description. And then if any of y'all have any questions during this tutorial at all, let us know in the comments down below and I'll try to answer whatever I possibly can. But let's go ahead and hop into the DAW so I can show you how to actually start taming your low end in your mixes and really help your mixes have that punch and that body that they deserve. All right, now we're in the DAW, but the first thing that I want to talk about is actually something that's not super DAW dependent. And I know it's going to be a boring tip that a lot of you have probably heard, but I do find it is true to be the most consistent, and that is that when you're working on your low end, you need to be able to hear your low end. So making sure that you have the right monitoring environment, making sure that you have full range speakers and a treated room can be a huge benefit. I know a lot of people are big fans of referencing while they mix. However, if you're in a room that's not super treated or you're on speakers that are not kind of meant to handle that style music or that low end, even referencing is going to be quite inaccurate because it could be as different as something being 10 hertz different. So the difference of you playing a G versus a G sharp. If your room has a room mode that's on a G and not a G sharp, and the reference has a G sharp and it sounds fine, but then yours doesn't, it's just gonna throw everything off. So if you have the ability to actually hang up some treatment, definitely take a little bit of time to treat your room. You can do some stuff like REW to figure out where you need to treat it and how you need to treat it. You can do things like the SonarWorks reference where you can make sure that you're kind of taming those big modes. But when you're treating your room, make sure that you get some thick absorption. You want to treat the corners. You could even do some tune traps or something like that, because most, especially smaller rooms, will have pretty big low end issues where, you know, a lot of rooms will have like a room mode at like 50 hertz or 60 hertz or 120 hertz, which just means that whenever it plays that frequency, the dimensions of the room are going to basically just blast that through the roof. So making sure that you can be in a good environment is huge. And I know a lot of people watching this will not be able to go spend hours and thousands of dollars on room treatment and monitors. But if you can't, I highly suggest getting a good pair of headphones that has extended low end where you can really monitor that, and then you can use your references with something like that because the headphones will not have an environment in them. So if you have a good pair of headphones that you can trust and you can listen to the latest Dua Lipa record to check her low end, that's a much better way to reference rather than just throwing monitors in an untreated room and trying to reference like that. Low end in an untreated room is going to be a mess. So when in doubt, head over to headphones because it can at least help get you in the right ballpark. And then you can always like car test and do things like that from there. But yeah, I just wanted to get that first step out of the way because I know it's a boring one, but I know it's an important one. Now let's go ahead and actually dive into this arrangement and start talking about step number 2, which is just making space for low end in your arrangement. So a lot of mixes that I hear that have low end issues is just because there is so many different things that have so much low end and the arrangement is just so busy that even when they throw on the, subby kick or an 808 or something like that, there's just no room for it to sit. So let's take a look at this mix, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mute the kick and I'm gonna mute this main bass, which is like an 808 in the verse. And you can hear how kind of open this mix is without either of those things.
Oh, I'd be lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your gravity since the day you met ya. Don't know why you do it, gotta.
So these synths, I'll show you right here, there's not much happening in the low end, but I'm also not doing like a high pass filter. So I'm not a big fan of just cutting out all low end of everything. It's more so doing like shelving and strategic scooping and just kind of building an arrangement that caters to nice low end. So you can see there's still some stuff happening down here in 50 and 100 hertz. It's just not so much that when I layer that bass over it, it's going to be a mess. And then same thing with the drums. Since we don't have any kick going right now, you're not going to see major issues down here. I'm not going to go ahead and do some kind of high pass or low cut or anything like that, because that can cause phase issues, it can cause pre-ringing issues, and it can honestly just take out a lot of body in the mix. So I don't think everything needs to be high passed up to like 80 or 100 hertz. I just think that if something is kind of filled with low end and it doesn't need to be what's carrying the low end, you can get rid of that. So in some of these synths, yeah, I'm doing some shelving, I'm kind of making room, because then once I pull in this 808 and this kick, there's not that much for them to compete with, because I know that these need to be the two main things that are making up that low end.
Oh, I'd be lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your gravity since the day you met ya. Don't know why you do it, got a hold on me. But
we're not going to get that clean, punchy, thick low end if everything has a bunch of stuff between like 50 and 150 hertz, and that bass and that kick are just always competing with elements that are pretty consistent throughout the entire arrangement. So tip number 2 is just going to be actually go into your arrangement and make sure that you're leaving room for some of those low end elements rather than having everything carry the low end. Let's take a look at tip number 3, and that's going to be picking the right source sounds or recording the right source sounds. So no matter whether you're recording drums or you're recording bass or you're picking samples, finding stuff that's going to be in the right key, it's got the right decay and release, it just kind of suits the harmonic content of the rest of the arrangement is going to be huge. Because this kick right now, let me take everything off of it, we'll get to all of this later, but right now this kick sounds pretty solid. It's punchy, it's got a little bit of clipper built in, and when I layer that with all the other drums, it sounds like this before I even do anything else.
Oh, I'd be lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your gravity since the day you met ya. Don't know why you...
It's a little loud right now because this R bass that we have later will end up pulling some of that gain down, but you can tell that we just picked a good sample from the start. It's a sample that fits into the key, it fits into the actual style that we're playing, and then same thing with an 808. So let me take off all of the processing on this. Here's the 808 that we ended up picking for the song. So we found one that's got a little bit of distortion in it. It's got some harmonic content, which we'll kind of talk about adding that stuff later. But let's go ahead and just compare that to if we just have something like this clean sine wave. It's clean, it's fine, the attack and the decay are pretty much the same, but and the whole mix is just not going to give us the same amount of beef.
Oh, I'd be lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your gravity since the day you met ya. Don't know why you do it, got a hold on.
And just making sure that you can find source signals that are going to highlight your mix and highlight your arrangement. That can take a lot of steps out of the mixing process and out of the processing process, where you can just make sure that you are nailing the sound. And keep in mind that the key of the song is going to be huge for how the low end communicates with each other. Most systems will kind of play subs between like 50 and 80 hertz, and then if a system doesn't have subs, it'll start playing at like 75 to like 120 hertz. But if we were to drag this 808 into a different key, we're not going to get that same response on the speaker. So it's just one of those things of like, you have to kind of pay attention to the key that you're writing in, because let's just say we drag these all the way down to here. Some of those other notes just start bottoming out, and they're not going to be that heard. But if you can figure out some kind of source instrument that sounds really, really good in the key that you are playing, that'll take a lot of that weight off of you when you actually get to the mixing process. Let's talk about tip number 4, which I briefly kind of brought up in the last point, but that is just nailing your attack and your release times. A lot of the time with low end, I figure people are having issues because they're just letting it sustain way too long, or they're not really having any low end because they're just chopping everything so short. So I can kind of show you a quick example, especially with this kick, right? So we have this kick, nothing's been done to it. It's short, it's punchy, but if I were to make this really, really short, you'll see that we start losing a little bit of that low end intensity.
Don't know why you do it, got a hold on me. But after all this time, you gotta set me free.
So if you have that decay way too short, you're gonna chop off a lot of stuff. And then, and the same part, if we actually, let's like increase this with like an envelope shaper, let's just say you have a kick where it's sustained out over here.
Don't know why you do it, got a hold on me, but after all this...
That's just a little bit sloppy, so if you can nail that attack and that release time of your kicks and your basses, and you can make sure that everything is kind of communicating with the rhythm of the song, you're gonna get rid of a lot of issues where things just overly sustain. Let's go ahead and like take a look at if we kind of process that clean 808 that we had earlier. And if I increase the sustain or increase the decay, you're gonna hear pretty major issues, where right now, this is kind of the envelope that we have.
I'd be lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your grip.
But let's increase that decay. Let's increase that release. And you'll kind of hear that that low end just starts to get a little bit loose and a little bit sloppy.
I'd be lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your gravity since the day you met ya. Don't know why you do it, got a hold on me, but after all this time you gotta set me free.
It just doesn't really have the right bounce that kind of suits the song, in which case it starts kind of stepping on the toes of everything. So you'd have to mix that bass lower, which then in turn would kind of suck out some of that low end energy, where if you can get it punchy, if you can get it tight, and if you can get it really lining up, you can have that bass pretty loud in a mix without it getting sloppy and starting to cover up all of your other elements and just sounding like a muddy mess. Let's go ahead and talk about step number 5, which is deciding the low end relation of your low end elements. So, you know, earlier we talked about kind of creating room in your general arrangement, but even within the low end elements, you're going to have elements that will take up different areas of the frequency range. And there is only a certain amount of energy and there's only a certain amount of volume and frequency range that a mix has. So you start having to kind of sacrifice things. So let's take a look at this kick and this 808 kind of layered over each other. So the kick is really peaking around here around like 70, but it's got some content down in the 50s. So basically we kind of started with a kick on this production, and I knew, okay, the kick is going to hit closer to 70. We'll talk a little bit later about how to add harmonics to kind of shift that around, but I knew, okay, that area needs to pretty much stay open for the kick. So what I'm doing then when I make my bass is kind of figuring out where I can write a bass pattern or a bass melody and what kind of instrument that I can use. So we're using this 808 that's generally going to fall a little bit below that. See, this is falling more between like that 50 and 70 and then going all the way down to like 40 on some of the lower notes. And when we can make sure that the kick and the bass are not falling in the same area, we can get rid of that, a lot of that frequency clashing and even sometimes phase issues that might come up, especially if you're using something like a digital kick that's probably just a super processed and clipped sine wave at some point. So if we can make sure that we are building a kick and building a bass in different areas that kind of communicate well, we'll get rid of a lot of that big clutter. And that just kind of goes back to picking the right samples and source sounds. It goes back to just creating room in the rest of your arrangement. But you kind of do have to decide, especially with things like kick and bass relation, where's the kick sitting? Is that going to take some of the higher low end where it's like that, you know, 70 to 120, where it's a little bit punchier, it's a little bit snappier? Or is it going to sit in the, you know, 40 to 50 range where it's super subby, it's super big, and it's kind of soft and fluffy? And then, you know, if that's the case, the bass needs to kind of shift up. So a lot of the time when you're hearing something like real bass on a track, you'll hear the bass kind of sitting between the 80 and the 120 area. And then you'll hear kind of a big, subbier, thumpier, kind of roomier kick that's going to be closer to that like 50 to 70 area. So if you're going to use a really, really low end bass, it's like an 808 or something like that, maybe get a kick that's got a little bit higher punch. And if you're going to use a little bit higher bass, it's, you know, maybe a little bit more organic, like say like a plucked bass, maybe shift that kick down a little bit just so you can kind of take up the whole frequency range without having things that are going to clash. Let's go ahead and talk about tip number 6, and that is to get fat low end, you really need to make sure that you have control over your low mids, because low mids are something that I think just kind of cloud up an entire mix, and there's something that really can make the entire low end just seemed a bit soft and a bit fluffy. So with this, like in this 808, I'm taking a little bit of like 260 out. And that's just an area that's going to hit most speakers in a kind of an unflattering way, especially for this 808. And it just makes the whole thing a little bit softer and a little bit more muddy. And when you have that kind of frequency that's happening in a bunch of things where it doesn't need to be, it's just adding all of this movement and intensity in areas that it doesn't need to occupy. Like, we have the low mids pretty much covered with like the synths and the guitars in this arrangement, right? So we have... But there is some mix bus processing on this to kind of help with that. So let's go ahead and let's mute this multiband that's on the synths. Because when we're working with low end, we're not only working with low end elements, we're working with the entire relationship of the mix. So right here, I was getting rid of a lot of that low end with multiband compression, really taming those mids between, what is this, like 180 and 600, and then I was just adding a little bit of top end in. But here's a listen without taming any of that in the mix.
I'd be lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your gravity since the day I met ya.
It's a little loose, it's a little bit softer, but if I can get those things in there and I can create a little bit more movement and a little bit more space in the lows and low mids.
Lying if I said I could forget ya. Caught up in your gravity since the day I met ya. Don't know why you do it, got a hold on me. But
it just makes it not so soft, it'll add a little bit of punch, and it'll give me a little bit more room for my more flattering low-end elements like my 808 and my bass and some of the lower synths and pads that we have in this. So here's a listen without. And then let's engage it. And you have to sacrifice a little bit of energy in some elements to create energy in other areas. So I generally find that if you can figure out how to really control that 200 to kind of 500 low mid boxiness, you can really kind of open up that low end to be bigger, punchier, and for like all lack of better words, a little bit brighter sounding. And you don't want to scoop your mix too much because there is a lot of energy to be had in the mids. However, if you're finding that your mix is just kind of a mess, probably start looking in that low mid area to start cleaning that out a little bit. Let's talk about tip number 7. This is something that you've probably all seen a lot. It's something I know we've talked about, and that is side chaining elements to kind of make room and create movement. So we're going to do that with this 808 and with this kick, because while they do kind of fall into their own respective areas, they're still pretty close on the spectrum, and I want to make sure that each element has its own movement, right? So without any sidechain compression, this is what it sounds like with the bass and the kick layered over each other.
don't know why you do it, got a hold on me. But after all this.
And what you may find is sometimes if you have like a kick and a bass hitting at the same time is that you'll have to turn that kick so far up in the mix that it starts really smashing mix bus compression, it starts really slamming the limiter. And a lot of that is just because it's happening at the same time as that bass. So to really poke out over it, you're just having to increase the volume an insane amount. And so what I'll do is just kind of create a little bit of space with something like sidechain compression, where it creates a little bit more movement, it creates a little bit more breath in the track, but it also gives that kick its own time to shine, where then we can get that sustain from that 808. So it's really easy to do sidechain compression. Let's just turn the kick back on so I can kind of show you. And right here, we have just the stock compressor in Cubase. All you need to do is you need to turn the sidechain on, which is this button right here, and then you just route it to whatever you want that to duck from. So we're going to make the bass duck from the signal of the kick. So we're going to have the kick as a sidechain input, and basically that just means that whenever that kick hits, it's going to take away whatever out of the 808 that we kind of program in here. So here are some of my settings. I did a ratio of like 3:1, pretty fast attack. Release is going to be huge for really sculpting your sound. I like to kind of do this depending on the tempo of the song. So I'll kind of show you what it looks like to mess around with that in 1 second. And then I just like to set like my ratio and everything from right here. And when I turn that on, you'll instantly hear that it's going to start ducking this bass. And it sounds a little funny in solo, like it almost sounds like it's taking away energy, which technically it is. But when you have everything kind of working together, especially once you start mastering it and throwing on all that compression and limiting, it really just opens up that space. And if we want to kind of mess around with that release is basically going to tell us how long does that bass get sidechained out for before it'll allow itself to come back in. So let's drag this release way up to like 300. When we have it up that high, we're losing too much energy, but when we have it down at like 10 milliseconds, it's not even going to do enough to really make a difference. I generally find if you're just trying to get a bass to duck under that initial low-end transient, especially like a big thumpier kick like this, anywhere between 50 and like 80 milliseconds is probably going to be enough to just suck it out of that area where you're not really competing, but not be so big that it's taking away too much energy. So just sidechaining something like that and then poking it in a mix will just open up a lot more movement.
Gravity since the day I met ya. Don't know why you do it, got a hold on me. But after all this time, you gotta set me free. Baby, I've been coasting,
And I would say use this sparingly. I think a lot of people turn to this as like step number one of getting their bass to sound really big. I prefer to kind of get everything sitting in the right frequency range and just make sure everything has its own space. And then if I still want a little bit of movement and I still want a little bit of a different relationship between that kick and that low end, then I'll pull in the sidechain compression. But this is more of like just wrapping it up at the end of a mixing session and not necessarily getting it there from the start. You can use sidechain compression as like more of an artistic thing like you hear in electronic music where it's making everything pump, but generally I'll prefer to just go pretty light like this and just kind of really make sure that I can create a little bit of space for something to poke through a mix without having to really slam the volume and throw off the entire balance of the mix. Let's talk about another tip, which is going to be adding some saturation and harmonic content to your low end elements. And this is huge for me, especially because most people will not be listening with a sub. They're going to want to hear this 808 on a phone speaker or on crappy AirPods or something like that. So I like to add harmonic content to low-end elements, which this 808 actually has a lot already baked in. We just decided to use an 808 that was pretty saturated. But what I'll do is I'll throw on, normally something like R-Bass, which is just kind of a harmonic exciter where I can just kind of shift around where this is going to lie. So like I said earlier, this 808 is generally lying in like the 40 to kind of 75 region. So I'm just going to add a little bit in this kind of 80 region to make sure that on smaller speakers that might have a little bit of low end, but maybe not necessarily a sub, we can really make sure that we are highlighting that area as well. So I'm doing a little bit of trim on here, but here's what it sounds like. And all that's doing is that's just going to move it up a little bit so, I can have help on smaller speakers. And then one thing that I like doing a lot, especially on things like 808, is doing some bit crushing so I can add some top end, because when you have an element like an 808 or a really low plucked bass, you can't really boost high end because there might not be much there, right? But you can create artificial high end with things like distortion, saturation, and in this case, bit crushing, which sounds like this. And it sounds a little wonky, but in the mix, and especially on a small speaker, it really helps that 808 come to life. And the reason I'm bringing this up for how to get your low end sounding really well is because I think that so many people mix their low end way too loud so people can hear it on different speakers. But instead, if you just really get some high end in there where it's a little bit more full spectrum, you don't have to then drive that kick or drive that 808 or drive that plucked bass so freaking loud that it's going to just throw off the entire balance and make the mix muddy. So if you can have low end that is a little bit more audible on small speakers, you really can adjust that balance to where you're just focused on the low end energy of, yes, this 808 and this kick feel really, really good in the context of my mix, and it's got enough top end where you can hear them on a small speaker, but I'm not that worried about that because right now the energy of my mix feels really, really solid. So a lot of the time I'll just add saturation like that. I'm doing it again to this kick with something like R-Bass where the kick sits a little bit higher and I want a little bit of sub content in there. So I'm just going to put this at like 49, 50 hertz. And that's just going to give me a little bit more low end thump. So if somebody does have a sub, that kick is going to knock just a little bit harder. And it's not going to eat that much more headroom up for my actual mixing. It just kind of gives you a little bit different flavor to play with. The next thing I'll talk about is kind of just building off of that. This is going to be step number 9. And this is just going to be layering your bass elements. And the reason you're doing this is very similar to like you would with adding harmonic content, in that you're not necessarily adding elements that are going to have a ton of low end, but you're going to kind of layer elements that mirror what the low end is doing, so it's a little bit more audible and discernible for the listener. So in the chorus, we have this big 808. But what we're doing is we actually layer up this wide bass. And you can see I'm just taming those low mids right there and giving it some top end. This is just like an actual bass that we played, and then I printed it with like some Haas effect just to spread it out. Give us a little bit of a weird texture. We're doing something very similar with like a chorus pad where this is sidechain to the kick as well, just to create that same movement. And then I actually am high passing this. So we have this right here just to make sure we're not going to get any low end that's going to cause issues. And then the same thing with this last bass layer. And in the context of the whole mix, it's very subtle, but again, this just allows me to not over mix that low end to make sure that it's going to be tight, but you can still hear whatever the bass is doing by adding these supplemental layers in. So here's with none of those. But when we add all of those in, you'll hear that bass a little bit more, but you're not necessarily going to feel it in the low end a lot more, which is good because it feels really, really good. We just need it to be a little bit more audible to our actual ears. We need to hear it more than we feel it. So adding elements when the bass feels good, add elements to help the bass be heard, but not necessarily felt. So none of these really need low-end content. They're just kind of supplementing what that bass is doing. And let's talk about our last step. This is going to be tip number 10, and this ends up coming at the end of the mix. But if you want to make sure that you have tight, clean, punchy, but still really thick low end, don't over compress your mix and don't slam the master way too hard. You can get a really, really loud, kind of punchy master without slamming it, because the first thing to start going when you are cranking a bunch of compressors and you're cranking a limiter and you're cranking a bunch of master bus saturation is that low end is going to lose its punch and it's going to start thickening itself. But if you've already mixed really thick low end in your mix and you start adding all of that stuff, it's going to end up falling apart. So I'll kind of show you just so you can hear a difference. So here's what we sound like with all of our compression. But watch as I start turning the threshold up. You're going to feel the bass start losing its punch and it's just going to become a little bit mushy. And then same thing with our limiter. Like, this is a pretty loud master, but we're definitely not slamming this by any means. I'm doing like maybe 2 dB, maybe 3 dB on like a really loud peak of the kind of mix bus compression, and that's the only compression happening. And then I'm also doing just a couple dB of limiting, and it's really just kind of thickening that sound and fattening that sound and gluing it together without getting that bass just completely mushed and smashed and just disgusting. So make sure that you are gain staging into your kind of mix bus and gain staging into your master bus appropriately. Otherwise, that low end will be the first thing to go. So you're going to figure out, okay, now my top end doesn't sound as shiny. My vocals are kind of sitting in a weird place in the mix. My low end has just lost all of its punch and all of its spice. And a lot of that time that just happens from over compression. So if you're finding your low end is not sounding good, take everything off the mix bus, follow all the steps that we talked about earlier in this tutorial, and then at the end of all that, if you're still having issues, ask us in the comments down below there, because there is something going on with your mix. But I think that pretty much does it for this one. All right, and that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you guys have learned a couple things on how to make sure you're kind of in the right environment to hear your low end. You're making sure that your mix is the right environment to actually cater to having the low end that you're kind of envisioning. And then once you have everything in place, you can actually start tweaking some of that low end, some of the bass stuff, the kick stuff, to get it feeling really, really good and tight in your mix. So if you guys have any other tips or you have any questions, let us know in the comments down below so we can interact with you there. If you want to support the channel, you can head over to makepopmusic.com and check out all of our other content over there. We've got some free content, we've got some paid content, and heading over there just helps support this channel so we can keep doing this every week for you guys. And then other than that, if you want to like, comment, and subscribe, that will absolutely help us with the algorithm to help get as many people having nice, tight, consistent low end as possible. But that's going to be it for this video. Let us know what videos you guys want to see next time. And until then, much love everyone. Peace out.